Hello and welcome to this Areopa webinar on AL patterns and guidelines. I can see that still people are coming in, but a lot of people have also already joined. So I'll get us started and run through the housekeeping and so on. But yeah, as you're used to, the recording of the webinar will also be shared on YouTube. So you can always go back to the early minutes if anyone misses anything. So probably to surprise some of you, this is not Luc van Vogt or one of the other well-known moderators of the Areopa webinars, but it's me, Tobias Fenster. I had the opportunity to come in today and do the moderation for this very interesting topic of AL patterns and guidelines. This actually is very impressively the 47th Areopa webinar so far with the previous history. So a great job that Areopa and especially Luc have done on those webinars. The speaker today will be Waldo. I hope he's not as confused as he seems to be on this picture. As I mentioned now multiple times, he will talk about AL patterns and guidelines and the initiative that he, together with a couple of other people, has kicked off in recent weeks and months. A couple of housekeeping rules before we get started. As you've probably noticed, your mic is muted, so you can't ask questions directly, but feel free to pose your questions in the GoToWebinar question window. I will collect them, and then in the end, we will have something like 10 minutes for questions and answers. So feel very free to put them in right in the beginning or during the event, and then we will ask them in the end. The webinar, as I said, will be recorded and published on YouTube. You can find the link here, but you can also just search on YouTube for Areopa webinars, where you have all the past recordings, and this one will also be uploaded during the course of the next couple of days. If you want to be notified about upcoming webinars, there is the Areopa webinar newsletter, where you can find the link here. And there also are upcoming webinars that are already planned. You can find them on the Areopa website. The next one that is coming is done by Stefano Demigliani. He will talk about working with files in a Business Central online environment. And then on April the 12th, I will talk about infrastructure as code, deploying Business Central in an Azure container instance, probably more on the technical and the infrastructure side. Areopa is continuously looking for speakers and topics. So if you have an idea what to show, what to present, then feel free to reach out to either the Areopa accounts or Luc van Vogt. So with that, I also want to thank the sponsor, ForNav, who is making those webinars happen, provides the infrastructure that we can use. So thanks a lot for this very valuable contribution to the community. With that, I am done with the introduction and want to hand it over to Waldo, who will talk about the patterns and guidelines.
Okay, thank you, Tobias. Let's first switch screens, right?
Yes, you should be the presenter now.
Not yet.
Sorry, I need to verify. This is the rookie moderator. Sorry for that. Okay, now it looks better.
Yeah. Do you see my PowerPoint? I guess so.
Yes, the ALGuidelines.dev initiative.
Yeah. So thanks so much for having me on Areopa. I have been here before. I always love it. I love the community, obviously. And I also love the initiative that I am actually going to present to you today. Depending a little bit on the time that I will spend, we will also dive into actual guidelines and patterns. But as said, that's depend a little bit on the time. So let's dive into that. Let's see what this initiative is all about. And before I do that, and basically to start doing that, I actually would like to go into a little bit of a history, the revival of a diamond. What do I mean with that? Well, there is a diamond that I try to even revive, right? And this diamond is actually the Nav Design Patterns Wiki. If you don't know by now what this is, well, the next 5 minutes I will spend time on what this is. This is actually an initiative from Microsoft back in the days. And when I say back in the days, I'm talking, I think, 2011, 2012. So quite a few years back, where Bogdana Botes, which is pictured here on the slide, she actually took it upon her to document what was totally not documented back in the days. Now, Bogdana is one of the, in my opinions, superheroes I mean, one of the best developers that I ever met, really nerdy and really meticulous in how to design software. And she was working at the time for Microsoft. She is still working for Microsoft, but not in the Business Central team anymore. And she noticed, like, look, nothing has been documented. We have internal guidelines, but these guidelines are not for the community. We have patterns, but totally no patterns are documented. So she took it upon her to create a team that well, actually was doing just that, documenting the existing patterns, coming up with new patterns, and involving the community for that. We had many meetings at Microsoft, online meetings, where we basically just talked about what would be interesting, how we should document stuff, and so on and so on. The result for this is what I already mentioned, the Design Patterns Wiki. If you just briefly open that, you'll see it's actually hosted at Microsoft, obviously, communitydynamics.com. They basically just created a space there. We, as a community, would not be able to decently contribute to it. Actually, what we did back then is we basically just sent a proposal for a pattern or a guideline to Microsoft, and they would review it that way. There was a lot of jobs that Microsoft did themselves. It was actually quite a huge work. If you, for instance, see here on the right, it's a little bit tedious to work with. I mean, you really need to click on the triangles here to be able to well, drill down to the content. But as you see here, a lot of familiar patterns that were documented. One of which maybe the number series pattern, which we all know, especially back then and still now, well described on what it involves to implement this on your own entities. And we also documented new patterns, one of which I'm pretty proud of, like this hooks pattern back in the days. In my opinion, very useful pattern back then, now completely useless in the world we are living in today. And that was actually exactly, let's say, a problem that I've been having for a few years. In fact, back in 2020, I did a session on DynamicsCon about AL development design patterns for the future. It's on YouTube if you would like to see that. And I actually was talking about new patterns for AL development and explicitly stating the thing, or the Nav Design Patterns Wiki, and the fact that we actually should well work on continuing that initiative. I didn't have any clue back then on how to do that. And even, I mean, a few years later, I did a blog post. I basically just decided for myself, like, look, I have no idea on how to do this. I have no idea on how to involve too many people for this. So let's just start doing it on my blog and just describe guidelines that I think should be interesting. Now, as you see here, the first blog post was guideline number 1, a referral to the Design Patterns Wiki. And the nice thing that happened actually after this one is that there was one person, Jeremy, that said, like, look, hey, I have an idea. Let's not do it on your blog. What if we would be able to scrape the content from the Nav Design Patterns Wiki? Because you need to understand this wiki stuff, all that data was just on the wiki, community.dynamics.com. But that's it. I mean, it's not like it was saved somewhere in Word files or whatever. So he had the idea, like, what if we could scrape it, convert it into some kind of repository, and then let that be a start of a new initiative. I really liked that idea, to be honest. And I actually reached out to AJ and Henrik. Reason for that is because Henrik and AJ already said during my session for DynamicsCon, like, look, if you need help, contributions or whatever, reach out to me. So I reached out to them, like, hey, what do you think? Would that be a good idea? And Henrik already came up with some ideas on to do it on GitHub, use GitHub pages, so people would be able to contribute to it in a very familiar way. So ideas came on the table, and I think we had quite a solid plan. The only thing that we needed at that point is Microsoft, and we needed actually permission from Microsoft to scrape the content and to put it somewhere else. So we reached out to Jesper and Freddy, which is actually how the ball really started rolling, because they came with the opportunity or the idea, like, look, we as Microsoft, we actually also want to continue that initiative, and even more, we want to contribute to it. We want to even implement whatever you come up with in our product, and vice versa. We want to document where we come up with, so you can use it in your software. So obviously a collaboration. And yeah, they actually, well, this is basically how the team was formed with Microsoft, and what the persons that are now actually involved in the ALGuidelines.dev. And I can say after that, all that and quite some work, we can say that the ALGuidelines.dev is born. First of all, it is obviously one of the goals is obviously to save whatever is out there. So Jeremy got to work, and he built something that converted the wiki to MD files, markdown files, something that we are all familiar with. And yeah, as this is all like talking about code and documenting code, MD files make a lot of sense. Obviously, we need to make sure, one of the goals, obviously, to describe new patterns. It's now AL, we shouldn't stick to CIL anymore. So we need new guidelines and patterns. For this, we actually want to involve the community, like your ideas and your new patterns. We need to make it possible for you to contribute, to write patterns, to write guidelines, basically to pull request new stuff into our website, let's say. On top of that, we should be able to discuss guidelines. Well, I'll go a little bit into that as well. And obviously, when we're discussing stuff, we might want to improve stuff as well. Now, the involvement from Microsoft, in my opinion, is also pretty important. I have a separate slide on that, so let's talk about that in a minute. So, guidelines and patterns, that's basically something that I mentioned a few times, but when you look into that, well, what is the difference and what do we mean with that? Well, when we talk about patterns, obviously we talk about design patterns, and for many people, especially in other technologies, let's say, design patterns, I mean, most normal thing in the world. It's basically where you start from to solve a problem, right? A design to solve a certain problem. Or on Wikipedia, it's described as in software engineering, and design pattern is a generally usable solution to a commonly occurring problem. Which also means when you don't have the problem, probably that design is not a solution, right? So kind of like indicating that a certain pattern can be an anti-pattern for a certain problem as well. I mean, you really need to solve the problem with it. Or as Jeremy has put it, like patterns are like flowers. On the right place, it's like a beautiful garden. On the wrong place, it's like a weed. That's also, yeah, I think this kind of like reflects a pattern pretty well. There's also, when we describe a pattern, we usually also want to describe where not to use the pattern. Where would this kind of design be an anti-pattern, for instance? Right? So when we put this, what is the difference between a pattern and a guideline? Well, in general, like if we look at the synonyms, so a pattern is a model or an example, while a guideline would be a rule or a principle. In a way, the guidelines is setting standards, while a pattern is a copyable design, let's say. And one of the things that I think is a good explanation to distinguish the two is that the pattern can only be applied in some scenarios. Remember it to solve a certain problem, right? While a guideline is basically a description that should always be applied because it's a guideline. It's setting standards. Whatever that standard is, it's setting a standard. Yeah. Both have a very valid reason to exist. Both have a very valid reason to be described. Yeah? And that's actually what the initiative is all about. So let's dive a little bit on the result. So what did we come up with? As you see, that it is a website with a nice welcome page, but obviously the magic is not here. The magic is in the documentation part, right? So you see here on the top, we have some links, and what I believe most of the people will be browsing in is in the docs side, which is kind of like a documentation part, the documentation part of our thing here. As I said, it's in behind the scenes, we will look into that. Behind the scenes, it's all MD files, but the front end is basically just HTTP. On the left, you will see some categories. Pretty important. As you see here, Jeremy did an amazing job in moving all that content, scraping all that. How we did that, I advise Jeremy to create a YouTube video on that. Maybe I have no idea how he did that, but he was able to just move all that HTTP content into already formatted MD files. And this is actually what you see here. So you see all these patterns coming back, the number series that I just showed you on the wiki, you see here as well, or the hooks that I was so fond of, it's obviously here as well with the screenshots and all that. So it's very searchable, it's very findable. Yeah, but on top of that, obviously, the intention here is also to work on new guidelines. It's mainly to work on new guidelines and patterns. So we have here new categories. So anything in a design patterns category or best practices category is basically everything that is current, that we can apply to AL development. And obviously with AL development comes, well, more challenges, like we have extensibility, we have the fact that we need to be upgradable and all that. So yeah, all these patterns will take that into account as well. Like we have now this facade patterns, we have the generic method pattern. If you don't know what that is, I mentioned this a gazillion times, and maybe if there's time at the end of the session, I might mention this again. But as you see, we have some nice design here. We have a good description, many topics that we want to cover, including the when not to use, which I find very important. We have coding examples and so on. So you can find patterns here, but you can obviously also find guidelines here. Yeah, guidelines being basically just setting the standards. How do I create an API page, for instance? What is the minimum that should be on there? Like pretty important, in my opinion, the fields that we need to put on there, like last modified date time, the one field that I tend to see that a lot of people seem to mess up, like naming it differently. If you name this field differently, your API page will not work decently. Like, so it has valid reasons to be described. What is the best way? What is the standard? What is the guideline to create, in this case, an API page. Now on the top right, we have a search. So just imagine we want to find some patterns or guidelines on subscribers. Then I can search for subscribers, and you'll see here, well, obviously a decent search. The only thing that I want to point out here, when you see nav patterns, you probably, these are patterns or guidelines that are looking into the archive. If you have best practices or patterns here, that's the new stuff. That's AL ready, let's say. And obviously you can click through and then have some kind of guideline, in this case on subscriber code units. On the top right here, you see navigation stuff. So you can already see that if you would have a problem with a guideline, you can create an issue for it. You maybe want to discuss it. Like this begin end compound seems to be a very passionate discussion going on. If I navigate to discussions here, and I would go to the actual discussion. There's one discussion on it. Then you see here quite a passionate discussion on should I use begin end and which and when and where to put that and so on and so on. That's absolutely something I love about the community. That's the the passionate discussions about something that some people would say this is not worth discussing at all. What you see more here is edit this page. Now this probably will not work because simply as a community member, you won't have the rights to just edit the page in the main branch. Obviously, I mean, this should go through some kind of pipeline, some kind of flow. I will talk about that contribution flow in a minute. But looking at the source is always interesting. Obviously, as I said, this is actually an MD file. So if I would go to the actual source, you will see here the actual MD file. So typical MD encodings and so on. Also, pretty important is the tag. That is something that we put a lot of effort in, and we are still going to put more effort into that, thinking about decently tagging all these guidelines and patterns. So for instance, if you're interested in API, or you're looking into an API page, but you're wondering like what else is there out there, guidelines and patterns about APIs, that you would be able to just click it. And here you see that there's one best practice, one guideline, and two patterns regarding APIs. When you're diving into APIs or have a big API implementation, then at least there are some patterns that you can read and refresh your memory and maybe come to senses in how to design certain problems. Yeah. So very important, the tag and the categories as well. So that's in a nutshell what we have now, and what basically the result is of what we did. Let me go back to the slides. So why is this Microsoft involvement so important? Well, it's kind of like, it's a little bit twofold. First of all, maybe threefold or fourfold. First of all, the fact that they are part of the approval team. I mean, I don't know if you have noticed, but the designs that we get lately from a lot, not I won't say all, but a lot of the new modules that we get in the base app or in the system app, it's pretty interesting. So I mean, I personally value the opinion of Microsoft quite a lot. On top of that, if we contribute as a community to guidelines and Microsoft is involved in that, they kind of like approve guidelines that we come up with. And if they approve, they kind of like are able to implement that themselves in their product as well. So we're having an influence, or we could have an influence on how they could design certain solutions. Maybe not directly to the solution, but at least as patterns and guidelines. Yeah. Obviously, there is some continuity in that. I mean, for now, part of the approval team is me and AJ and all that, and Jeremy and Henrik. Sorry, I need to name all of them, obviously. But what I mean with that, I mean, we are just people from the community. In my opinion, it could be anyone. And if I decide to leave, or somebody else wants to be a contributor or an approver, well, by all means, we're totally open in that. Okay, talking about contributions, you can contribute, and to be honest, I hope you will contribute. I even would say you must contribute. But yeah, how do we do that? Now, since we are all developers, I tend to believe that this is going to be pretty easy to you or very familiar to you. The process to contribute to any kind of code base should be, well, as easy as contributing to this as well. As I said, it's all MD files, and these MD files are obviously part of some kind of repository. I will go into that in a minute. But yeah, in a way, it's just that. You can contribute simply by forking, perform your changes to your own fork, and then pull request the changes back to our repository. Now, as you have seen, it's pretty nice design. The design is actually something that's actually just a website. And what we are doing actually here, we are converting all these MD files into HTTP files, which are getting used as GitHub pages. That is actually what's going on in the background. So that's also why, like, this page looks pretty different if you would go to the source. Yeah, and the source, as you see here already, is just an MD file, an index of MD file. Now, obviously, while developing this, this is all you see, right? This code. So while developing this, it might be interesting that you would be able to convert that in that HTTP representation in the end result. Now, we are using Hugo. Hugo is like this, let's say, site generator based on MD files, what you can basically just implement in GitHub pages. So we used Hugo for this, and you are able to install Hugo locally to basically just have a local version of the ALGuidelines.dev site, where you can obviously see directly on how your new contribution, how your pattern, how the design of that is going to look like. Now, personally, I think I did like most of the design guidelines and a few patterns. I never used Hugo locally because I could pretty much imagine how it was going to look like. Although I must say I did some mistakes as well, and then you see the pipeline failing and all that. So when I got this to work on my local machine, now I'm actually always using Hugo locally, just to make sure that whatever I'm pushing back to the repository, that it will work. I know that it's going to work, and I don't need the feedback anymore from the pipeline. Okay, before we will go into that, let's talk a little bit on the approval process. So there is an approval process. There is a minimum of 3 code reviewers. There are 6 people that can review, and there's a minimum of 3 reviewers. I think that is important, and you will see in many of the reviews that we are, let's say, quite meticulous on that. On top of that, obviously there is a license agreement. I don't know if you saw it, but this repository is hosted by Microsoft. This is a Microsoft repository. So that kind of like means 2 things. We need to comply with their rules, and one of their rules is that we comply with their license agreement. So that kind of like means if we comply with their license agreement, then they are able to use whatever we come up with. So in my opinion, that's how a collaboration is looking like. So by implementing this license agreement, we know that whatever we contribute, Microsoft is okay with that, and they will even be okay with using whatever we come up with. And there is nothing bad on that, obviously. As you see here, there's also a Hugo build pipeline. Obviously, there is a site generator going on. What we display is HTTP files, and what we create is MD files, and there needs to be something that moves to one to the other. Okay, let's go into this contribution part. How do we contribute? Obviously, one of the most important things, in my opinion. Only with your contributions, this initiative will grow. How do we do that? Obviously, this is also described on the site. As you see here, we have this, already talked about the design patterns and the best practices. We have the old stuff here, and we have a contribution part, basically a description, how can you contribute? And one of the most important things here, in my opinion, is the templates. We made it, let's say, easier for you to describe what we think you should be describing. I mean, you should think about when not to use. You should think about the usage description, the problem, the context, and so on. Same for patterns. Oh, sorry, guidelines. So this is a guideline pattern, let's say, where you should think about providing the bad and the good. How does it look bad? How does it look good? What is it all about? What advantages does it has? Yeah. So templates. Basically, what that means is that you will be able to copy paste file and basically just fill in the missing parts, and that's it. Yeah. As I talked about Hugo, we also have a description on how you can install Hugo. There is a movie on about it. What I simply do, and it works for both my machines, is I simply just use the script. It's a PowerShell script. Execute this part once, and when you clone if you would clone, you need to clone because you need obviously the code, the MD files. You need that to have that locally. So when you clone to the repository, then you need to execute this within that repository. Because we are using submodules, we are using themes actually. So you need to have that extension, that submodule installed on your local machine as well. So this once, when you have cloned within the repository, and then you're good to go, and you're basically just able to run a local copy of Hugo, basically your local copy of the entire site, as you can see here now. And then if you're not completely sure on how you can fork and pull request, well, there is also a description how you can do that. But let me just go quickly through that myself. So if I go to the GitHub site, you'll see here again, it's a github.com/Microsoft. It's a Microsoft repository, meaning that none of us will be able to contribute to it directly. There is no commit that I can do in any branch of the Microsoft repository. So I need to fork that. Forking kind of like means that I will basically just create a copy of the entire repository to my local account. So I already did that. You see here, I already did copy that to my Waldo 1001, which you see here. So what you could do, obviously here already, since this is completely my repository, I can just press dot and I go into, let's say, Visual Studio Online or Visual Code, VS Code Online, whatever, how this is called. But I can actually already contribute. To see this is just a browser edition of VS Code, and I would be able to just, start contributing. I mean, I can go into content docs. You see basically the same structure as you have seen on the website. Let's say this structure here. And then, as I said, there were templates. So in the contributing part, I can go into templates and start like copy and paste the template here. For instance, I can all do that online. For a simple guideline, this is, I mean, all you need. Obviously, for the, let's say, more complex guidelines or patterns where you have a lot of, let's say, markup or markdown that is going on, like you have seen here, for instance, contribution fork, you see some warnings and notes, and you're not really sure on how that is done, and you really want to like test that design first on your local machine, right? Then you don't do it online, obviously, but you clone it. You simply take your repository and you open VS Code and you clone it locally. I already did that. In fact, this is the repository that I actually already cloned, and that is the repository that's basically my repository, my fork. Yeah. And I even already did some changes. As you can see here, there were a few changes that I wanted to do. Just minor changes, like in the API page, I wanted to, I mean, AJ was talking about default fields, but they are not that deep. They are very mandatory fields. So I rephrased it a little bit and so on. Custom telemetry, there were some prosa text, and I wanted to indicate some bold. So that is where I made some stuff bold, but which I think would make sense or make a better readable thing here. I also changed a little bit on the pattern. So just to indicate, yeah, this is not really contributing a new pattern, but just changes on existing patterns. Obviously, everybody is entitled to do that. Whether it gets approved or not, I don't know. But at least if you have a problem with the guideline and you have some suggestions to improve, you are able to clone and improve them yourself. Yeah. Just imagine I have a new guideline that I would like to improve. As I said, I can simply just copy paste the pattern, the template. So let's take this best practice. I will copy, I will paste that into best practice, paste. I can rename that to Areopa demo 2 because I already have an Areopa demo 1, as you see here. And that's all. And now I can just start to create title and so on. I will call it Areopa so you can see what's going on. And here is just a matter of like changing the green stuff here with something that makes sense at that time, creating a decent description, use some code blocks and so on. So that is what we could do. Obviously, I have no idea how this could look like. And this is where this local Hugo would come into play. Now, also that is quite simple. So just to reiterate, what I did is I executed this, and I already executed this. By including the first depth of the submodules, I actually just included these submodules, which I need for Hugo to work, let's say. So what I could do now is just say Hugo serve, and you see I do that within my repository. Yeah. And what it's doing now is basically starting a local instance, a local, let's say, web server, and compiling that entire set of MD files into a workable solution, a workable website. So I can navigate to my local host now, and you will see here that I actually just have a copy of the entire AL guidelines on my local machine, including the changes that I did. So I can navigate to docs, to design best practices. I can see the 2 Areopa sites that I created. Yeah, this is the one that I just created. Yeah, so you can beautifully see the design. I can obviously also check whether my changes came through. Let's see. That was something with mandatory fields. So yes, indeed, it's mandatory. Yeah, and the nice thing is while you are developing, yeah. So let's just imagine that for this mandatory thing, I just want to have a default again. I will save this, and automatically you see that Hugo or the service that is running at the moment will automatically pick up the changes and update it on the site itself. So I will undo this because I do want to have it mandatory. There we go. So I staged the changes that I actually would like to commit. So all we need to do, I don't want to commit the Areopa sites, by the way, but I do want to commit these. So what I would be able to do now is simply just contribute like any kind of code that I would contribute. I will some cosmetic changes, for instance, and I will commit that. I'm pushing it to my version, so to my Waldo AL guidelines. And now I should be able to contribute and create a new pull request. And this pull request is going to be one to the Microsoft AL guidelines. I can review the 3 files that I changed, and you see here is pretty much the same changes. And this is how you can contribute as well. At this point, Microsoft AL guidelines gets a new pull request, and this will go through the complete approval process, basically, that I already talked about. Just to indicate that approval process, if I would go to the pull request, it's already closed. Let's see, maybe the number series was quite an interesting one, something that Jeremy created. Jesper had some comments on it. Henrik had a lot of comments on it, and you see here how we go about that actually. And the idea, obviously, whatever, but I mean, the nice thing is that we all actually look at this from another angle, and then obviously any comment would improve the pattern as well. All right, so that is how we can contribute. Now, how do you apply this to your organization if you would want to? Now, do know that I strongly believe that in an organization we need guidelines. As I was explaining just before the session to Tobias, like I always ask the question to anyone who does a job interview at my company. I always ask the question like, what is your top 3 guideline, development guideline? What do you find very important while you are developing? And I must say, in many occasions, I see many doubts like guidelines. Or if I hear a guideline in 80% of the time, I hear like, yeah, Hungarian notation. I need to like indicate what kind of variable it is in the name of the variable. I mean, then looking in how many guidelines there were for NAV, there are already for AL, like design patterns. I mean, in my opinion, a company and development, the development department of a company needs to set ground rules, needs to set a standard. You need to make sure that everybody is speaking the same language, meaning talking about the same patterns, and are also implementing a solution the same way, even going down into using like begin end the same way, or using the variable naming the same way. For a company, in my opinion, that's very important. So setting that up, well, now at least with the ALGuidelines.dev, you have a reference. You might agree with, you might not. Well, it's kind of like for you to decide what guidelines make sense to you, what patterns make sense to you. Yeah. Do know during a code review, I mean, a code review is a very good way in many ways for you to take a grip on those standards that you might have set. Yeah, I mean, a code review gives you an insight in how good a developer is, or what his level is, or his what you need to teach him and what he can teach you. I mean, it's a very good way to have a look into your, basically to have a feeling on the level of your, I don't really want to call it a level, maybe. I mean, to have a good feeling on your developers, right? In many ways, what you could also do is look into these guidelines, or at least the guidelines that you want to support in your company, and make them mandatory knowledge. Yeah, I mean, in my company, we can simply say, did you implement the discovery pattern, for instance? And if you don't know what the discovery pattern is, well, at that point, we have a site, right? And we can look up the discovery pattern. There is a discovery event. That's actually the one that I need. And this is actually, I mean, you have a common language within your company. And if discovery event pattern is one pattern that you implement a lot, well, that is absolutely mandatory knowledge. So you could set up some kind of, let's say, index on what is the minimum knowledge that you should have in your company. At least, yeah, these are ideas, but don't underestimate the power of code review. This is the one thing that I will never give up in my company. We are code reviewing every single contribution to every single repository, meaning a product or a customer. And I'm not saying we prevent all the mistakes or we basically prevent all bugs, absolutely not. But we do get a picture on how good the patterns are implemented, how good the AL guidelines are implemented, and which people need more training and more guidance. And we come along new patterns that we are very interested in, obviously. Yeah. Alrighty. So, as promised, if there is time left, I will go over some content as well, what we have. Did I hear something?
You have almost 15 minutes left. And so far, there are no questions, just feedback by Jeremy that he used an interesting tech stack of JavaScript, Node.js, Python, Ruby, and PowerShell to do the conversion. So I fully agree. I would love to see a video on how he did that.
Absolutely. Jeremy, you need to do that video. And I would actually also love to see that, to be honest. Okay, so let me spend then the remaining time to give you a little bit of overview what I think is very interesting, although I do think that all the content at this point is very interesting. So let's dive a little bit into the actual content. As I said already, what I think is really important, obviously, is not what is not the most important thing what's already out there, although it's very interesting to look at. I mean, know that these coding guidelines that you see here, and we still have, I mean, Jeremy has converted the text that was on the NAV Design Patterns Wiki. These are actually internal guidelines from Microsoft. Do they make sense? Maybe not, but at least it's now interesting to see what the guidelines they were taking into account. So every single commit that they did complied with these guidelines, which is actually quite a lot. I mean, you see here all the guidelines, and Microsoft did a fabulous job in basically put that online, make it searchable and all that, and basically just give it as a reference for us to picking it up. But obviously I want to focus a little bit on the best practices and guidelines that we have today for AL. Obviously there are some very obvious ones. I mean, like where do we put the and else begin, one line or not? I mean, these are, in my opinion, very fair guidelines. And should be followed the same way by every developer. Right? Just imagine that some do it like that and some do it like that, and they are both working in the same code base. I mean, you don't want to be in that situation. So it makes sense to put guidelines per company. And you separate if and else, obviously put it on different lines and so on. It makes all sense. These are the pretty obvious ones. Then we have some less obvious ones, like the one that I already mentioned, like this begin end compound. We noticed there is quite some discussion about that. Some prefer it even what is indicated as bad code here. some prefer it even always put begin end, even if there's just one line, whilst others prefer it the good, like it's indicated as here as good code. Is it bad? Is it good? Personally, I mean, yes, I described it and I put bad code here. And this is also a guideline that we follow. I mean, we do it like this. This, even for me, is more readable than this, but it's a personal choice. And I mean, this is not worth any discussion. Although I do believe that it is worth a discussion on how to do it. I mean, sometimes this in a company, again, can be confusing. I already showed you the API page. Do know, I mean, this is, in my opinion, very, very important. And when we look into the API tag, we will see that we have two patterns as well. Two patterns that I value actually quite a lot. The register field set is a solution to figuring out in which fields were provided and which fields means, and basically how I need to act on in a modification scenario. And how to handle that modification scenario, we have this delegate API operation where you can, when you basically have a pattern on how to handle the insert, modify, delete in an API operation. Very, very interesting. Facade pattern is one that Microsoft has contributed, so described by Jesper from Microsoft. And if you ever looked into the system app, you'll see that there is a lot of facade patterns going on there. And I must say, reading through the pattern gives you a very nice and good understanding, first of all, how they do that and what you can expect from basically every module that you find in the system app, but also how you need to read that. Right? How you need, what you can expect from it, what you need, how you need to read that. So basically the facade pattern means that there is one facade being one public accessible code unit that houses the and describes the methods that you are able to use. And whatever is down below, that's something that you cannot touch from outside, let's say from your dependent extension. This is what usually the implementation part is for. So that's typically internal. Now, obviously, there's more to it. Very interesting pattern. Read through that and you get a better picture in how it works, and maybe that you can also implement that in your scenarios. Yes, Tobias.
Yeah, we have one question here. In the future, do you think it will be possible to create a code cop based on these guidelines?
I hope so. I absolutely truly believe that it's possible to create code cops on most of the guidelines. I think Stefan Maron is already very busy with that. I hope that Stefan will join the team and actually create code cops based on these. Absolutely. I think it is possible. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We actually already contacted Stefan about that. Not very formally, but basically just like, look, we are working on an ALGuidelines.dev initiative. You are working on your code cop. Maybe we can join hands. I mean, how would you say that? Join team. I mean, makes all the sense in the world. Absolutely. Yeah. Maybe one more thing, generic method pattern. If you haven't heard me talking about that, this is the one pattern that I hold on to, not the one pattern and not the only pattern at all, not at all. But this is one that we have implemented, completely tremendously in our product. And the idea is to implement a lot of possibilities in just one pattern, to have extensibility, to have decoupling ability, let's say, to have also encapsulation of a method, and all that by simply implementing this pattern here, where you have always an on, before, and after for every single method that you are creating. And since this is a method that is completely encapsulated, but basically meaning this could be a block customer method or could be also a document post method, sales document post method, for instance. But any kind of method that you can come up with is that you always have an on before and after, and you solve a lot of extensibility problems. Just imagine order of execution of subscribers. I mean, I need to make sure that my code is executed after that method. Well, if you implement the generic method pattern, you will always have an after method because that simply exists here, right? So you would be able to always like hook into and after that method instead of just some kind of generic method and just subscribe to that once and have one subscriber and then have with a lot of code. So it just solves so many problems. I can go on about that, but obviously it's described here, and I can, together with all the patterns and guidelines that we already described, and there's a lot more to describe, which I would like to end with in a minute. Well, I can only obviously recommend to read through the entirety of it. So where I would like to end with is the discussions part here. What we decided to do, we created this discussions forum, and this is actually a to-do list. You see here, not only just we try to use this as discuss a pattern before it is described. We also have, you see here actually what is on our to-do list to be described. A lot of guidelines and patterns, and I can only ask you to participate in the discussion. It's on the GitHub, and we are looking forward to any kind of feedback, positive, negative, on any kind of the patterns that we are, well, is to be described or even is already live on the guideline.
We have one more question where I think I know the answer, but I let you because I think you're kind of passionate on that one. In a follow-up on the code cop question, will some of these patterns find their way into the various AL snippets?
Absolutely. I'm actually thinking about removing the snippets part from my extension and creating a separate extension with only snippets. So that people are, I mean, not bothered that if you don't want the snippets and all that. Not really part of the discussion, but absolutely this is, I mean, I think it's even described on one of the guidelines. I think it's a generic method pattern where we have a snippets part as well. Here it is. So the idea is absolutely to foresee snippets when it makes sense. And yeah, it's just part of the thing. So it might happen that there will be an ALGuidelines.dev extension in VS Code that contains the snippets that are described here as a pattern. That's one of the ideas that we have. Very good question. Okay. So other questions?
Let me see. I'll also take the opportunity to go back to showing my screen while we wait for additional questions, and say thanks again to all participants. Most of all, thanks to you, Waldo, for presenting this very interesting topic, and for the whole group for making this happen. I guess also to Microsoft for being so open about it and allowing the community to run with it. So really also great. And then also you see the links here on YouTube, the newsletter that you can join, the email if you want to get in touch. And if there are no more questions, and I don't think so, then I leave it to you, Waldo, for famous last words.
No famous last words. Thank you again. Thank you again for the opportunity. As you might have noticed, I'm pretty passionate about this topic. That's probably also because of my job. This is basically what I do all day. I need to follow up on developers and basically give them a standard to work against. So yeah, let's say thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I hope that we can expect a lot of contributions from the community, obviously, as well.
Great. So with that, I'll stop the recording. Again, thanks to all the sponsors, and hope to see you or hear you on one of the next webinars as well.